Men of Co-Creation this month. And today, Chad Lefevre and I are having a most important conversation. And before the break, we talked about how that developed, right? And where the idea of the most important conversations came from, and really this desire for us to commune in different ways, right? What kind of a world can we create? And I did it, as a lot of us did during the pandemic, a lot of reflecting and sort of seeing, what is it that we're all saying right now? And we had the luxury of talking with many, many, many people who work in spaces of transformation, and they've been working in those spaces long before the pandemic, right? I don't know if we were getting things ready. Who knows what all of that was about, right? Because here comes this pandemic, and a lot of us saw the culmination of things that we had been talking about or working on. And in that spot, I was really reflecting on all the conversations I had with these brilliant people on the show, and the commonality was we all do believe that we can do better. We all believe we can have this kind of world where we can coexist. We've seen enough examples of it. And so then it becomes the question of, okay, if that's really what we want, what would keep us from having that, right? And I believe this conversation, the idea around having the conversation from an emotionally intelligent place, an emotionally aware place, being present to how we're feeling isn't something most of us are trained in. So, Chad, how did you do that, right? And this is all about the men of co-creation. And a lot of times we look at the masculine lenses as having issues in the emotional department, but for sure the feminine lens has its issues in the emotional department, and we all get to share in that, right? Without looking at the binary. How did you? What was your walk in that as you developed your emotional intelligence to be able to sit here and say, I think we can talk about these things?
Yeah. Well, it was kind of taking a step back and and working to decipher and decode what is a human being, like what is the experience of a human being versus a human doing. And I always joke that it's in the language, right? When the first time people often will meet someone, they'll say, what do you do? So we're obsessed with doing. And so that leads us to a frenetic sort of experience that disconnects us from a sense of being. And so I started to look at sort of what are the elements that would constitute, a thriving human being. And one of them, obviously, I arrived at was the fact that emotions are something that, in our culture at least, we're often taught to press down, to suppress, to ignore, to not give too much attention to. And so I started looking at that, and I realized that trauma is sort of informing a lot of the behavior that we're seeing in the world here. And a lot of that trauma exists because there are unexpressed emotions, and have been unexpressed emotions in many people's lives for decades. And they end up in this inertia and this routine of a doing existence. And they have shunned the being existence, which requires emotional awareness or intelligence, or what I call the wisdom of emotions. Now, why does that matter? And, we call the most important conversations what it is. Why we call it that is because human beings, one of the ways that human beings create is in conversation, is in dialogue, is in shared experience. Well, if we're not accessing our emotional states, and we're not present to it, and we're not masters over it, it's going to be very difficult for us to have any type of co-creative conversation with someone else without having these sort of nasty triggers that kind of pop up and make it difficult for us to be fully self-expressed, to be fully tapped in and aligned with who we are as a human being. And how do you create from a place when there's confusion within yourself? So the connection between what I call emotional sobriety, which includes emotional intelligence, and the ability to collaborate and to co-create, is very tightly knit together. And what we're seeing, I think, culturally in our society in many areas right now, are people trying to have a conversation, but because the emotional state of the human beingness has not been handled, and there's this focus only on the doing, or mostly on the doing in many cases, it makes those conversations not co-creative and collaborative, but confrontational. And so you get that as an outcome when you don't have that emotional intelligence or sobriety or awareness.
Yeah, that really tracks, because when we dove into the specifically the empathy in comparison to looking at the energetics, it gets real tricky in those spaces because we chose to peel apart those who are predisposed to what we would consider empathy versus those who really get their intuition through those emotional cues. Their techniques are very different. Their use of emotional energy is very different. And that's when we started to get real clear about how important it was to talk about, and to your point, to talk about what our experiences are, because we're not having the same experiences.
Yeah.
And we're interpreting each other's signals or our energetic signals from our own filtration processes, our own systems.
Yep.
And we're misinterpreting and we're misreading a lot of energetic signals because we don't know how to talk about our emotions, right? I mean, that really is base camp, folks. Like literally base camp. If you can't say, I feel sad, right? We teach kindergartners that. I feel sad is a really important step before that person did it, right? It's a really important moment in your existence, even if you don't say it out loud.
Yeah.
It is a really important moment and it determines everything about how you create moving forward. And I dare say it is the thing that's going to allow people to make that shift from the mindset or the worldview of I am this way because these things happened to me versus I choose to be this way so these things can happen for me.
Right.
And that switch, you cannot make that switch if those emotional programs run you. And if they run you, right, it's because you're unwilling. They're saying, hey, we're on overload, dude. You're not paying any attention.
Yeah. Yeah.
Memer, right? They're going off and you're going, what? Nope, nothing. Like, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this. And you're like,
yeah.
That's going to override your system at some point, and usually at the most inopportune moment.
Yeah, no,
So
for
how do we
sure.
help people with that? Yeah, go ahead.
So our program, so the most important conversations has many things going on that addresses this. One of the things that we do is we run a 1 year long workshop, and people are like, what are you talking about? A 1 year long workshop? Who's going to sign up for that? And my response is always, well, people go to church every week. So it's not, outside of the realm of possibility that humans can do something with some form of regularity that is going to advance themselves, right?
Internal discipline, what?